Welcome, everybody. It's Wednesday, November 26th, 2014. And today I wanted to share with you an interview I did on a show called African American Conservatives, because I was happy with how it went, and also I thought maybe you might find it interesting to see how I deal with a conservative audience. I have a lot in common with conservatives. I absolutely insist on that, in spite of the fact that people like Anthony Gregory are constantly reminding me how bad conservatives tend to be, but I still think of the old days when I was a kid and I was a conservative, and I wasn't a bad person. I just didn't see the whole picture, that's all. And I want to try and reach out to those people who are in the same situation that I was. But when I'm on a conservative podcast or radio show, I never really know how it's going to go until I get there. I never know how I'm going to be treated or what kinds of questions I'm going to be asked. I mean, typically I'm treated pretty respectfully. I haven't run into too many problems. But for example, when I was on the Dennis Prager show, we had a very nice conversation about domestic policy. And then when we talked about foreign policy, well, I just gave him my views. I thought, what's the point of being on here if I'm going to be mealy-mouthed about it? I just came right out and told him, and it just shocked him. But I had to tell him the truth. I had to say what was true. I had to tell his listeners. So anyway, this program, African American Conservatives, you can find out more about it at AfricanAmericanConservatives.com. I was on their Blog Talk radio show. That's where this comes from. Before we get to that, though, I have a couple things I want to tell you guys that I'm telling you guys first before the rest of the world. The first thing is I am having a Black Friday blowout at LibertyClassroom.com. Surely you know someone in your life who could use the gift of knowledge. Students, autodidacts, people who are lifelong learners. You know a lot of these people. Liberty lovers. What a great gift to give them knowledge. And now LibertyClassroom.com is more attractive than ever because we now have 11 courses. The 12th course is coming in a few weeks. You can listen to these courses on the go, on your mobile devices, or you can watch them in video format, whatever you prefer. You can ask us all the questions you want. I'm one of the faculty members. Everybody who's a faculty member on that site is somebody I trust and whose work I respect. You can ask us all the questions you want in our discussion forums. We have a live session once a month where you can ask us your questions in real time. We give you recommended readings for the different lessons so that you know what's reliable. You don't have to navigate the literature on your own. It gives you the tools to be a great debater, to be really knowledgeable about history and economics, to get the education that we all should have gotten, but we did not get. And if you're saying to yourself, boy, I wish I could be like Peter Schiff and just wipe the floor with people, or I wish I could be like these people I listen to every day. I wish I could be like these people to be in such command of this material, but I'll never be able to do that because I don't have the time to invest, or I don't know what to read, or I don't know where to begin. That's why I created LibertyClassroom.com 2.5 years ago now. So we're having a blowout on Black Friday, but it's actually available starting right now for you guys. Over at LibertyClassroom.com/gift, you can give gift subscriptions at 50% off to anybody you think would benefit from a membership to the site. Now, if that includes yourself, by the way, you too can get this kind of discount, and you can get it using coupon code FRIDAY in all caps. If you're buying a gift subscription at LibertyClassroom.com/gift, no coupon code is necessary. But if you're buying one for yourself, use coupon code FRIDAY in all caps. Then secondly, I myself am making use of some Black Friday specials. There's a company called Music Radio Creative that I've used in the past for things like podcast intros and outros, and I saw the other day, and I don't get any money from them or anything for saying this, but I thought some of you guys might find this useful. I'm always badgering people, start a blog, start a podcast. So if you're in the market for that, I saw on Facebook they're having a 33% off deal through Black Friday or to Cyber Monday or something on all their intros and outros and recording services and all that. So I need an intro/outro package for the podcast I'm going to be doing with Bob Murphy for the Refuting Krugman thing that we're going to be doing. So I'm probably going to use this. That's great. I mean, what a deal. In fact, I'll probably buy a couple of these so I can redo the intro for this show. So Black Friday is great. Another thing is, and then I'll get you to the African American Conservatives interview, but I want to let you know about this. I've told you guys before, I use WP Engine on TomWoods.com because I have a bunch of websites, and I've used a bunch of hosting companies. I've used HostGator. I mean, you name it, I've used it. And I've been frustrated with almost all of them. It's too slow, or it's unreliable, or my site is down for 10 hours, and I'm pulling my hair out, and I'm on the phone, and I can't get through to anybody. It's awful, basically. I mean, if you absolutely have to use one of these places, then use it. But you get what you pay for. And for my money, WP Engine is the best decision I ever made. I don't worry at all about TomWoods.com being unstable or being down for 10 hours at a time or whatever, or being slow. I don't have to worry about that because of WP Engine. Well, I just got in an email a note that they're doing a 4 free month special. And that's a great deal. 4 free months of hosting from the best people I have come across. And believe me, I've used them all. So they've got this special deal through Cyber Monday. I would grab it if I were you. Quickest way to do that is tomwoods.com/engine. Yes, this does benefit the show, but it's a great deal. I mean, 4 months free with WP Engine, and I would only recommend them to you because I've used them. And as I say, I've used everything else. I used everything else so you don't have to. And I found out that WP Engine is the best. So check them out at tomwoods.com/engine and use the special coupon code CYBERHOSTING14. CYBERHOSTING and the number 14 all smushed together and get yourself 4 free months of hosting. All right. Let's turn now to African American conservatives, and I hope you enjoy what you hear.
Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thanks, Marie.
Apparently, you are a better libertarian than you are a lunch date. You described in the preface to Real Dissent how on a lunch date with your mother, of all people, you were preoccupied with composing the definitive smash to libertarian critics you call the, quote, gatekeepers of permissible discussion, end quote. Who are these gatekeepers, in your opinion? And with the rising popularity of libertarianism, do you find their criticisms increasingly muted, or are they continuing to resonate with the American people?
Well, that is the million-dollar question right there. All that's exactly what I'm driving at in the book. I think a lot of your listeners will recognize what I'm saying when I say that it seems as if the New York Times has laid out for us the boundaries of allowable opinion. That sure, it's okay to criticize taxes, but only if your criticism takes the form of, I think the top marginal rate should be 34% instead of 39%. Like that they're absolutely okay with. Or I don't like the way the government is taxing me. The amount is okay, but maybe they should tax me via a sales tax rather than income tax. The New York Times is absolutely fine with that. But if you come along and say, I think I just don't accept the whole moral principle of income taxation, then you're an extremist, you're out of bounds, we don't have to pay attention to you, you're not one of the good, responsible people we would invite to our cocktail parties. And this seems to hold true across the spectrum of issues. It could be the Federal Reserve System. The correct range of opinion, according to the Times, is should the Fed inflate this much or should it inflate that much? If you were to say, well, wait a minute, is it really compatible with a free market economy to have an institution that's trying to plan money and interest rates to try to balance inflation and employment and production? This seems like a planning agency. This doesn't seem compatible with the market economy. Then again, you're not playing by the rules. So when you look on TV, on the Sunday talk shows, by and large you see people who are engaged in phony dissent, who their criticism is, they're 3% different from what the host is saying. The reason I have a book called Real Dissent is that I think we need to set these 3x5 cards of officially allowed opinion on fire, because they're confining us to a range of views that have been disastrous failures for the country. So who are the gatekeepers of approved opinion? Well, the obvious ones would be the major networks, where the guests they have on are carefully screened to make sure that we have a little bit of debate, but basically when push comes to shove, we're really fundamentally on the same side. We don't have any real dissenters on the TV. I think in particular of left-wing thought, I call them thought control websites like Media Matters and Think Progress, which is funded by George Soros. And they just make sure that if anybody sets 1/2 an inch off of that 3x5 card, they are going to come down. And the thing is, they don't refute you. They don't say, well, here's why you're wrong about the Fed, or you're wrong about taxes, or you're wrong about capitalism. It's just, you're a crazy extremist, so we don't have to refute you. You don't deserve a refutation. That's the phenomenon that I'm going after here.
Exactly so. One libertarian argument that continues to reverberate is the argument to end the Fed. Not long ago, one would hear the anti-Fed Reserve arguments coming from former guest of ours, Dr. Ron Paul. But today we hear such arguments from diverse people such as Ted Cruz, Elizabeth Warren, Newt Gingrich, and Bernie Sanders, that the Fed should be audited, if not eliminated altogether. You wrote, quote, "We have been forced into a box that confines our choices to various forms of statism. The movement to end the Fed is an astonishing and most welcome first step toward clawing our way out," end quote. Is the movement to end the Fed growing in your view? And if so, why?
Well, I think it is growing, but it is still a very small sliver of the public. And you and I, no doubt, spend our time with people who are very much engaged with issues like this, and sometimes we think to ourselves that, my gosh, it's interesting that these ideas are really gaining traction. And all you need to do to disabuse yourself of that is take a trip to the mall, walk down the mall, and it's filled with people who don't know what on God's green earth the Fed is, couldn't care less about any of it. But among young people who are bright and willing to entertain thoughts that aren't approved for them by the New York Times, there is a rising interest in this. And it's because with this crisis that occurred in 2008, the mainstream economists were just blindsided. They had no idea there were any problems. They had absolutely no clue what was wrong, and they really couldn't come up with an explanation as to what to do or what. I mean, they really were caught completely unawares. Whereas it turns out there was a school of economic thought that was fully aware that this was going to happen, and they're known as the Austrian School of Economics. There are many of them in the U.S., and they were saying this is exactly what's going to happen. You're going to have, in fact, you mentioned Ron Paul. On the House floor in 2001, he predicted the whole thing. He said, we just got done with this dot-com boom and bust, and now the Federal Reserve is blowing up a housing bubble, and that's going to go bust. I mean, exactly what happened. So there is an interest in how did these economists know there was a problem with the economy? And the answer is because unlike 99% of economists who are bootlickers of the Fed, these people have been critical of the Fed and said that this institution interfering with interest rates, pushing interest rates artificially low, we should know as free market economists that you can't do that without paying a price. In the same way that if you interfere with prices of any kind and you try to push them artificially low, you're going to pay a metaphorical price for that. You're going to discombobulate the economy. Well, so much more when you are manipulating money and interest rates, which permeate the economy. If you screw that up and you send the wrong signals to investors and consumers, people are going to make a lot of bad decisions based on these false interest rates. And the result was the crash that we saw. Now, I'm happy to say that you mentioned that I have 12 books. That is indeed true. 2 of them were New York Times bestsellers, and one of them in 2009 was called Meltdown. It was on the financial crisis. It was a free market explanation of what happened in the financial crisis. And to me, the fact that a book on economics, a book on the Fed, and a book on boom and bust cycles hit the New York Times bestseller list means things had gone very sour. It is very hard to get the public to read a book on that subject. But when they saw their retirement portfolios cut in half, well, suddenly they sat up and paid attention. So at the very least, the silver lining was that it became a teaching moment.
Exactly. Another key point you make is that, quote, morality and the market are mutually reinforcing. It isn't merely that the market requires certain moral attributes in order to function properly. The market itself encourages moral behavior, end quote. How so?
All right, now this I realize will run counter to a lot of people's instincts because we've been taught to believe that the marketplace is where greed gets free rein and people are materialistic and so on and so forth. But people have been materialistic under every conceivable economic system ever. It's not like under communism people stopped being materialistic. They still were. But the way you got material stuff in the Soviet Union was you were part of the bureaucracy, the apparatchiks, you got special privileges by virtue of being a party member. It wasn't because you pleased your fellow man by producing an innovative new product that was affordable. That's how you get rewarded in a market system. You have to think about other people constantly. But you didn't have to think about other people in the Soviet system, and in other systems you don't have to think about other people. So the market, first of all, forces you to think about other people, whether you want to or not. Whether you're greedy or selfless, you have to think about other people. And then secondly, of course, the virtues that are encouraged by market competition would be things like thrift and good stewardship with resources, which, again, when you have the opposite of the free market, when you have government ownership of something, there's no reason for there to be good stewardship. Why would there be? Nobody suffers if resources are, let's say, squandered because nobody owns them. So there's no penalty for it. So you're encouraged to have these good virtues. And I sometimes think when I look around, I'm 42 years old now, and I'm well on my way to becoming an early curmudgeon. When I look around and I see, frankly, the way a lot of young people act, like the way they've been taught to act. Like, let's give you a quick example. My wife and I were having a weekend getaway at a hotel, fairly nice hotel, last weekend. And there was some sports team, young, like high school kids who were staying there. And they made it basically impossible for us to stay. We had to leave and get our money back and go to another hotel because they were, boisterous, loud, no respect for private property at all, no respect for the place they were staying. And the coach had been contacted by the hotel staff, and his answer was, well, they're boys, that's how they are. Now, 50 years ago, that coach would have sat them down and say, I expect you to behave like gentlemen when you are here. You are reflecting your school and your parents and the values they instill. Today, that would be laughed at. So given that, the only thing at this point that I can see, other than religious background, the only thing I can see that's ever going to teach manners to some of these kids is when they're forced to wait on the public, is when they are forced to cater to the public to earn a living. Then all of a sudden they will be forced to have good manners, to be respectful of other people. And so, again, the market institution encourages important values that oftentimes people aren't going to get any other way.
I'm a little older than you are, so I absolutely concur.
Okay, good.
Critics, I won't say exactly how old, but I am a little bit older. Critics of capitalism, ranging from presidents to Nobel Prize winners, attack it on the basis of income inequality. Pope Francis, for example, argues that, quote, while the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states, charged with the vigilance for the common good, to exercise any form of control. A new tyranny is thus born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules, end quote. Why are the Pope and others wrong on income inequality in your view?
Oh, gosh, I did a whole episode of the Tom Woods Show specifically on the Pope Francis document. It was just me talking for 40 minutes, and I had people saying that was the best thing they'd ever heard in their lives. So I was very grateful. I was wondering, is this coming out well, or it just seemed like I'm yelling into the microphone? And I say this, by the way, I'm a Catholic myself. I've actually written a book on this whole subject. I wrote a book called The Church and the Market, Defending the Free Market Economy, so that Catholics won't feel like, well, I've got to advocate policies that are obviously harmful to most people. You don't. Okay, so in terms of income inequality, there are a whole bunch of ways to tackle this. One way to tackle it is to look at something called the Gini coefficient, which a lot of mainstream economists use to measure inequality. And if you look at every year they do the Fraser Institute in Canada, and I think in tandem with the Heritage Foundation in the U.S., they do a ranking of countries in terms of how much economic freedom they have, the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And if you take the top 25 freest economies and you compare them with the bottom 25, the 25 least free economies, and you compare them on the basis of inequality, it turns out that the 25 least free economies are vastly more unequal. There is vastly more inequality the less capitalism there is. That's kind of the opposite of what people would think. Now, moreover, to me, what matters, and it makes no difference to me that a minuscule, negligible number of people have their own private planes. That affects me in no way. And it is spiritually corrosive and destructive for me to be worried about this. It has nothing to do with me. It in no way, they didn't get that plane by stealing anything from me. It has nothing whatsoever to do with me. But think of it qualitatively. Think of the standard of living that people enjoyed 500 years ago as compared to today. Think of how much the poor have advanced as opposed to how much the rich have advanced. Because 500 years ago, how do the poor get around? They get around, or even 200-300 years ago, they get around on foot, basically. And if they have a pair of shoes, they're lucky. The rich would get around in a coach and four, a coach driven by 4 horses. Today, how do the rich and poor get around? Well, the rich man drives around in a fancy car, and the poor man drives around in a beat-up car. But they're both driving around in a car, which makes them vastly more equal than they ever were. As a matter of fact, in I think it was around maybe the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was trying to gin up anti-Western propaganda. So they showed the film version of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath to show just how miserably Westerners lived. But it backfired on them, because what impressed the Soviet audiences was not that people were so poor in the West. They couldn't get over that the Jode family had a car. Like, to them, that was incredible, that somebody who was poor, a poor family, could actually have a car. When we look through the vast majority of world history, long before there were free markets, look at the way the average person lived. The average person lived on roughly $1 a day. I mean, not just the average person. 85-90% of the public lived on $1 a day. And then maybe it went up to $2 or $3 a day. But under the market system over the past couple of hundred years, we've seen these levels go up 10, 20 times. Like, there's been nothing remotely to compare with this in terms of the conquest of poverty around the world. Long before welfare states were established, the market was already bringing about prosperity for the poorest. In the United States, the lowest quintile of income earners over the course of the 20th century saw its purchasing power increase between 10 and 20 times. So their standard of living goes from extreme deprivation to a point where today even the poorest, not to make light of people's poverty, my wife grew up in an extremely impoverished situation, but I'm a historian. I want to compare things to how they've been around the world historically. People enjoy, even the poorest, enjoy luxuries that the greatest kings of Europe 300 years ago could not even have dreamed of, much less enjoyed themselves. And this has happened under the impetus of an economic system that we are all taught to despise, to blame for everything. It is a bizarre case of Stockholm Syndrome on a society-wide scale, where governments have done nothing but hamper the process by which markets make us more prosperous, and we're taught to love those people but despise the boss who actually gives us a check. It is a completely inverted morality we have.
Also defend another aspect of capitalism against another attack. And that attack you summarize as, quote, under the unhampered market, we'd be at the mercy of vicious monopolists, end quote. You reject this fear, even calling famous monopolists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, quote unquote, benefactors of mankind. What then is your view of what some would call modern-day monopolists like Verizon, Comcast, and even Amazon? Do you oppose net neutrality?
I do, but I'm not enough of a techie to be able to talk to you about it in any depth. I did a show on it. It's one of these things where all my listeners were demanding a show, and I thought, look, it would take me 10 years to master the information related to net neutrality. But in terms of these other companies, I think this is a case where the way we understand history impacts the way we understand current events. So, in other words, if you think that in the 19th century we had, monopolists everywhere and, little guys with white mustaches running around carrying sacks of money with dollar signs on them were running the economy and everybody was suffering. If that's your picture, which is what I got in school, by the way, I mean, I understand why people think this, then that's going to affect the way you think about the economy today. You'll say, well, good heavens, we've got to have the government involved. We don't want to go back to being under the iron fist of our feudal overlords in the private sector any longer. Well, in the book, I spend some time, as you say, talking about what's the real truth about what happened in the 19th century, and it, as usual, is not exactly what we all got in the 7th grade. But in terms of today, generally, my view is that monopoly is a meaningful term only when you're talking about government barriers to entry to competitors. If the government says no one's allowed to compete with such and such firm in the production of such and such good, then that is a monopoly. But if you just have a case where there's just one provider of a good, that's not necessarily a monopoly in an analytically useful sense. For the longest time, Alcoa was pretty much the only supplier of primary aluminum in the U.S. But prices went down consistently. We think of it, if it's one supplier, the price will just go up and up and up. But one supplier knows that if its prices go up beyond a certain point, somebody will come in and compete with it and force those prices back down. Or people will find substitutes for aluminum. Or whatever. There are other market pressures that tend to keep the prices down. So in fact, when Alcoa got in trouble for being a monopoly, it was the height of the absurdity of the antitrust regime. They were told that their problem was that they had been so innovative and they had responded to every challenge with great skill and alacrity, and this was a criticism, not praise. So I'm not in any way threatened by Amazon. In fact, Amazon is I think the last quarter Amazon lost over $400 million. That maybe their competitors are just sitting and waiting patiently. Amazon shareholders are subsidizing my purchases, apparently, because Amazon keeps losing money. I don't know how much longer they can do it on that business model. Certainly they're not threatening me in any way. They've improved my life dramatically. If I want to buy a vast array of things, I can find them all in under 10 minutes. That frees me up. I'm a busy guy, and I've got 5 daughters, and I want to spend time with them. And now I can spend a lot more time with them because some of the drudgery of my life has been replaced by a pleasant, simple, rapid customer experience. But any other things, whether it's utilities or anything else, I always look at what is the government's special privilege that's usually behind it, and I usually tend to find one.
You reject the flat tax, saying, quote, there's little point in substituting one kind of institutionalized expropriation for another, end quote. If the idea of a single rate doesn't appeal to you, what would your ideal tax system be?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I mean, let me say this. Given that I, as an individual, have zero influence over anybody who's going to be in charge of making tax policy, when I make statements like that, it's not to say that if taxes were lowered, I wouldn't immediately complain that they hadn't been lowered to zero, so therefore I don't accept your lowering of the tax. I'll take lower taxes over higher taxes, absolutely. And if a flat tax meant that on balance there was less wealth being extracted from the private sector, I would favor the flat tax, but not because it's flat. I'd favor it because less money is being taken. Like I would take a progressive income tax if the rates were 0.2%, 0.8%, 1%, and 2%. I would gladly take that over a 10% flat tax. So it's not the kind of tax to me that matters. It's the amount of dough that's extracted from the public. Well, I mean, I'm somebody, I told you before we went on the air that if you compare me to some other guests that podcasters will have on, I tend to make them all look like Hillary Clinton by comparison because I'm so free market, so libertarian. I mean, ideally, my favorite tax regime would be no taxes whatsoever. And they say, how could that possibly be? What are you talking about, you crazy lunatic? Well, to make a long story short, I mean, this is not a question that really lends itself to a brief answer. But I'll say that my view is if we had to have a tax, let's suppose that you twisted my arm and said you have to have a tax, then I would favor the Murray Rothbard solution, which is the equal tax, which would say that We should have, in the same way that when you go to buy a loaf of bread, we don't say, well, if you're a rich person, or we don't say you have to pay, the loaf of bread is 10% of your income. So if you're a rich person, you pay more than a poor person. Or we don't say we're going to have a progressive set of prices for a loaf of bread. So if you're a rich person, you even pay a higher proportion of your income for a loaf of bread. No, everybody pays $2 for a loaf of bread. Rich or poor, doesn't matter. Everybody pays the same. Well, likewise, it seems to me that taxation should be no different. Everybody should pay the same. And if everybody pays the same, that automatically limits how much they can take, because not everybody can, if you have to set it at a level that everybody could afford, it would have to be pretty low. Now, I realize that there's no political chance of that happening, but the point is, what I am driving at is that I don't approve of the principle whereby government is more or less assumed to be the owner of everything. And it can decide at its discretion what it thinks prudently it can get away with ought to be the tax rate. There's no controlling an institution like that. So I would much rather, instead of bickering over little details, I'd much rather come back at them with a completely radical alternative instead of coming back at them with some mealy-mouthed little compromise, because that doesn't get us anywhere.
You wrote, quote, "The poverty rate in the United States fell from 95% in 1900 to around 12 to 14% in the late 1960s, a period in which government anti-poverty measures were fairly trivial. By the late 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty programs began receiving substantial funding, the poverty rate stagnated. By 1994, it was about the same as it had been in the late 1960s, even though the federal government was, by that time, spending 4 times as much per capita as it had under LBJ," end quote. Has the poverty rate then simply reached its natural level at about 15%, or has the government, by making poverty tolerable, simply frozen the poor at their current income level?
I think there's a little bit of both there, because I think there will always be a sliver of the public that, for whatever reason, simply will, either it's a lack of will or whatever, there will always be some people who just will not prosper and won't take the steps to prosper. Like, we all know people who, if we gave them $1 million today, they'd burn through it in 2 months. We all know those people. Mm-hmm. So those people will always be with us. But I don't believe that 12 to 14% of the population is that way, naturally. I think some of them have been made that way, or have been, I think their lives have been turned upside down precisely by the welfare system. And in some of my other work, I've talked about the work of Charles Murray, who very controversially in the 1980s said that the reason that poverty has stagnated under government anti-poverty measures is not despite the government's involvement, but rather because of it. And he goes on and lists all the various incentives that are created. The problem that we're facing here is that there is a natural inclination among human beings to seek after our goals with the least possible exertion. That's a natural tendency in human nature. We want to get what we want with as little effort as possible. And we have to, therefore, be on guard against this instinct, because whenever we make it more attractive or whenever we increase the ability to get what you want with less exertion, there will be marginal people who will then respond to that incentive. So that the more, you say, well, look, we only need to spend X billion dollars to lift everybody out of poverty. Well, assume that for once, most of that money actually reached the poor. Even assume that. Those figures are always wrong, because it's a dynamic situation. Once you start spending X billion dollars on poverty, and you thereby make it more attractive to be in that situation in the first place, you then entice people who are on the fence, barely making it as the working poor, to simply get themselves in a position that entitles them to the benefit. So over time, the tendency is to have a smaller and smaller percentage of productive people at the top supporting an ever-growing sector of people at the bottom who are looking to get various benefits. And now, by the way, this is not just the poor I'm talking about. All through society, whether it's big business looking for subsidies, everybody wants to reach his goals with the least possible exertion. And the result is everybody spends time lobbying the government for special privileges, for transfer payments, to expropriate their neighbors. Instead of spending that time productively, they spend it in this antisocial way, and we wind up with a low-intensity civil war of every group against every group. This is an impoverishing effect. This has an impoverishing effect on society. So it's vastly better for the care of the poor and those in great difficulty to be left at the most local level possible, where you have people who are familiar with the circumstances of the individuals involved. It's not just an anonymous check that comes in, and it's not a check that comes in on condition that you don't find work and you don't get married and you don't. I mean, I from my own parish, I know of people who desperately need employment, and reasonable jobs come to them, but they are so locked in an entitlement mentality, they're looking for their dream job, and meanwhile they have kids to support. It has been an absolute poison in the lives of countless people.
One of the criticisms laid against conservatives in Real Dissent is that they are warmongers, or as you put it, quote, unquote, the war party. However, philosophers and theologians have long wrestled with the concept of war, and many, rather than deciding to be flatly against all wars at all times, have labored to create some sort of just war theory as a means to distinguish bad wars and wars worthy of their support. You describe yourself as anti-war. Does this mean that there are no wars that you would support under any conditions, or have you formulated your own version of a just war theory?
To clarify my position, I mean, when I was a younger guy, I pretty much supported every military intervention you can think of, plus 30 more that never happened. I was absolutely in favor of all of them because my view was that if you don't support them, then you must be a pinko commie who hates America. And then as I looked at it more closely, I thought, in the same way that I find the government pretty much can't be trusted to do anything productive on the domestic side, maybe I should be a little bit more skeptical of what it can accomplish on the foreign side. Like all of a sudden I'm being told, boy, these people can't run health care or the post office, but they can remake the political culture of a 1,400-year-old civilization that seems impervious to such changes. See, when I became a conservative early on as a kid, I was a conservative precisely because I was not utopian in my expectations of what's possible in the world. And yet when I look at the conservative establishment today, they're all utopians. They're basically, a lot of them I think are just leftists who like low taxes, but their assumptions are almost all leftists. So now in terms of my views, I would favor a purely defensive war. Like I'm not a pacifist. Like certainly if somebody came up to my family and started hurting them, I would fight back. And likewise, if somebody invaded my country, I would fight back. But I think today there's been, it's just a matter of, there's this or that power that's coming to the fore in Syria, so we've got to, really? Nobody expects anything good to come of that. By this point, we all know that every single thing that's been tried since 2001 has totally backfired. There was no ISIS in the Middle East in 2001. We would all vastly prefer to have that situation back as compared to what we have now. It's vastly worse because conservatives fell for the Woodrow Wilson left liberal utopian scheme that if there's a bad guy in the world somewhere, it's just a matter of replacing him with another guy. I just can't believe that conservatives have gone for this. So I don't have a just war theory, because I find that every iteration of just war theory can be interpreted by the advocate however he wants. I've never seen a just war theory that actually works in making somebody say this war is unjust. They always just manipulate it or they interpret it in a way that benefits them. So my view is just if it's defensive, then it's legitimate. And we have to be very strict on what we mean by defensive.
As the homeschooling mother of three, we at African American Conservatives have proudly promoted homeschooling as often as possible. In the African American community, we are concerned about the black-white achievement gap. We are concerned about educational reform, about school choice. And some time ago, as I alluded to earlier, we had on as our guest Dr. Ron Paul so that he could promote his homeschooling project. You are heavily involved in the homeschooling movement as well. could you tell us about your site, tomwoodshomeschool.com, what we could find there, and how it is related to what Dr. Paul is doing?
Yeah, sure. He's got a very ambitious goal. He wants a K through 12 curriculum with the first 5 years or 6 years. I think K through 5 they want to make available for free, and then it's price competitive after that. But I'm basically designing courses for his site, for ronpaulhomeschool.com. I'm designing courses for that, and I have a government course. I have 2 courses on Western civilization. I'll have a course on the U.S. Constitution, and these are really substantial courses because we're mimicking a real high school course, which would be 36 weeks, 5 lessons a week. So I do 180 video lessons per course. Now that is basically impossible given that I'm doing 3.5 courses. I mean, you can do the math, and it's pretty much sucking all the life out of me, but I'm consoling myself that this is going to do a lot of good for a lot of people. And could you imagine 180 lessons on the U.S. Constitution and its history? I mean, these kids will go out into the world knowing more than anyone, which is fantastic to me. But not just know, it's one thing to have a lot of knowledge in your head, but if you can't convey it to anybody, it's just sterile up there. What good is it doing anybody? So the other part of this program is that we teach people public speaking, which is, as you know, a lot of people are terrified of. We teach them public speaking. We teach them how to write. We teach them how to start their own blog, how to already be hitting the ground running as soon as they're out of high school, to be shapers of ideas, to be opinion leaders. So I'm doing that. So my courses for that, you can get them at ronpaulhomeschool.com as part of the whole curriculum. But I set up my own site for people who maybe don't want to join the whole curriculum. They just want my courses because they follow my work and they like my work. So I set up my own site, tomwoodshomeschool.com. But those are basically the courses that I've prepared for Ron Paul's program. And as I say, if you go to ronpaulhomeschool.com and you just look at the arguments for why you should do it, it's at least worth giving a try, because we've had a lot of parents say, my kids are flourishing under this program. They've learned how to learn on their own. Like, I don't have to sit down with them for 5 hours a day anymore, because it's a self-taught curriculum. After the 6th grade, it's entirely self-taught, and the students help each other out if they have trouble. It takes a lot of the burden off the parent, and it's preparing them to know what their worldview is, to be able to defend it, and to be articulate. I mean, these are skills that every one of us wishes we had, and every one of us wants for our kids. So when I was asked to come on board for this project, they were halfway through the sentence, and I said yes.
Absolutely true. My children have always been homeschooled, with the exception of my daughter. We didn't adopt her until after her kindergarten year, but my other 2 children were homeschooled the whole time, and all 3 of them are very independent in their schooling. I give them, here's what you need to do, and they are interested in their own schooling, and so they do things on their own independently. With, I'm the facilitator, and when you have a child that's utterly engaged in what they're doing, they are interested and they pursue their own education because they're invested in what they're doing. And I think people who listen to the show are probably tired of hearing me say this, but as we tape the show right now, my 16-year-old is at his internship at a software company, and he is part-time at college. So, homeschooling, kids are just interested in pursuing their own education. They are totally invested in what they're doing, and they are ahead of the game.
Well, I am so glad to hear that you've had so much success with it. That's really a wonderful story.
It is. And, I don't say it to brag, but it is just, you can do so many different things with it. And, we've got friends, because we're here in Silicon Valley, who are in the tech industry, and they've told me, my son is really ahead of the game because one of them works at Google, one of them works at Apple, and they said, we get candidates that are the cream of the crop who are they flood us from all of the top schools in the nation, and we get resumes by the truckful, but none of them have any real world skills. They come from these top schools, but none of them are doing what your kid is doing. He's in college at 16, taking programming classes, but he's also working an internship in a software company. You know, he got an
Exactly.
internship at 15. So he's got more real-world application than most of the people that apply to these top companies.
Exactly. I mean, that's going to make his resume rise right to the top. And this is especially important in 2014, where everybody knows you can't navigate this economy the way your parents and grandparents did. They went to school, they applied for a job, they stayed with that job for 40 years, and then they retired. It doesn't look like that anymore. And so you have to blaze your own trail. And if I may mention one other aspect of the RonPaulHomeschool.com program, is that we also will have courses on starting your own business, ideas for starting your own business. Because there are home businesses that you can start as a young person that can blossom into something else, but they have to start thinking entrepreneurially and not just imagine themselves as a well-educated cog in the machine.
And, you know, I guess I should say that, too. He has his own business. He has his own Etsy shop. He's a guitarist in a band, so he sells guitar picks that he's made out of old credit cards. So,
all right, that's just great. I mean, this kid has yeah, I mean, he's going to have the world, eating out of the palm of his hand.
I know. Homeschoolers can take over the world. It's an amazing thing. But anyway, Tom, how can we continue to follow your work?
My major site is tomwoods.com, and there you've got links to my different books and stuff of that kind. You've got my podcast, which is I've got almost 300 episodes of it now. It goes Monday through Friday. I've got many downloads per episode, so people are indeed listening. It's not just my mother, although my mother does listen. I'll point out. And then the other thing is the book that we've been talking about, Real Descent. I made a landing page for it at realdescent.com, and there you can find out about it. There's a link for I actually read the audiobook, and you can get the audiobook for free through a link at realdescent.com. I decided to do that because I've gone through mainstream publishers in the past. Random House, Basic Books have published my books, and they don't even ask me if I want to read the audiobook. They hire somebody to do it. And sometimes the person's good, and sometimes the person is reading your book the way you might read the instructions for operating a microwave oven. And you think, oh my gosh, why are you, what has happened to you, man, that all the life has been taken from you, that you would read my book this way? So I finally did it myself. So you can find that at realdescent.com as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being our guest. I hope you'll come back.
Thanks, Marie. It was a pleasure.
All right, everybody, I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. We will not be having a program tomorrow, but we'll have one on Friday. So make sure and tune in then. I so appreciate all you guys who tune in, all the kind words. I appreciate all you guys letting other people know about the show. You guys are my best advertisers. Word of mouth has done wonders for this show, and I am deeply grateful to all you guys. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. See you Friday.
The Tom Woods Show.